Muy buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the beginning of the second season of these regional policy dialogues of the Inter-American Development Bank. My name is Gabriela San Pedro, and I work for the Transport Division of the Infrastructure and Energy Division of the IDB. And it's a pleasure for me to welcome you to the topic that brings us here today, challenges and opportunities for digital transformation of infrastructure agencies. During this event, we will have simultaneous interpretation into the official languages of the IDB, English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. And for this, you have the interpretation services at the bottom of the screen. You go to the bottom, you click on the globe, and then you select the language of your choice. I recommend that you silence the original audio in Spanish.
During this event, we will have simultaneous. For this, please go to the bottom of your screen. Click on the word icon and select the language of your choice. I recommend that you mute the original.
You also have to know that we have the chat section activated. Please introduce yourself and let us know where you come from, what institution and what country you represent. For the questions and answers here, we will activate a frame that is called a Q&A, where you can write down your questions and address them to the different panelists. And these will be answered to the extent that we have the time to do so. Nowadays, the issue of digital transformation has acquired a greater relevance for the context in which we are now. Infrastructure, public infrastructure units have had to rethink, redesign, reconsider their processes in order to maintain their digital modernization and their self-reliance. And before I give the floor to our VP, Ana Maria Rodriguez, I invite you to watch the following video that shows three essential aspects for digital transformation. Please, let us take a look at this.
Vicepresidenta, por favor.
Vice President, please. Thank you very much. And I wish to thank all the extraordinary panelists that we have with us today. Thank you to my colleagues at the IDB for organizing this regional policy dialogue. Thank you to all participants and good afternoon, everyone. For me, it's a huge pleasure to be here with you and participate in this regional policy dialogue on digital transformation of infrastructure agencies. I believe that this is a dialogue that couldn't take place at a more timely time. It is timely, and now it has led us to reconsider our way of life, our social relations, and the way we work. And besides being timely, it becomes an urgent dialogue. All the necessary actions in order to flatten the curve have been an unprecedented event in the economic activity in our different countries. For example, last week, ECLAC projected a lag of up to 10 years in levels of income per inhabitant. However, that curve and that economic tightening has not had an impact on all countries at the same level. There are some economies that were better prepared in order to deal with this virtually, and those are that are better navigating in this new world where there's less physical movement and a lot of social distancing. It has been evident to see the access to digital technologies, which is absolutely essential. In this context, which is extremely overwhelming, we find a huge opportunity to do something that had been taking place little by little, which is accelerate digital modernization in infrastructure agencies. Acceleration and changes that will allow us not only to improve this sector and manage a crisis. I believe that this is truly an opportunity to take a substantive efficiency leap in transport services and logistics. Before the pandemic, one out of every four transport infrastructure agencies had implemented some sort of a work, 25%. But now we see that 95% of these agencies are doing this telework one way or the other. However, many people still don't have computers or sufficient internet connection and cannot work from home, thus having a negative impact on the productivity of these agencies. In a case, for example, of an Andean country, a Public Works Transport Agency stopped all its work since March 15, and we're only able to go back to it at the beginning of June. Other agencies that, with the support of the bank, had begun to implement a virtual communication from Costa Rica or the state of Pará in Brazil are moving forward. But as the video was saying, they cannot make sufficient progress if they don't have elements as informative framework, adequate regulatory infrastructure, a human resource that is adequately trained, infrastructure systems, sufficient digital infrastructure systems. And when dealing with these modernization processes, without these elements, the structural change of key elements is practically impossible. For example, most of the control entities still call for paper formalities to comply with the standards, and that obviously makes it much slower and delays the execution of the works. That is why transformation agencies and infrastructure, digital infrastructure, must be endowed and connected with all the other institutions in the public sector. It is not enough that one of these agencies is modernized and it doesn't tally with the rest of the public institutions. Therefore, we must ensure interoperability between the different agencies and ministries and macro measures of governments, both national, federal, and local. Modernization and digital cooperation, and I believe that nowadays there's a concept, and we see the benefits as huge benefits, and one of them was mentioned on the video, which is cybersecurity. The sector and infrastructure agencies in general are not exempt of these hacks. On the contrary, the number of hacks have increased because to the extent that we make a more massive use of digital instruments, the attacks on the sector increases. And it not only leads to conflicting interruptions, but it also delays the results on development that an infrastructure agency wishes to achieve. Therefore, it is critical to have practices and measures at a national level, at the agency, at the employee, and at the user level that would enable us to mitigate these risks. As you will see, this interoperability, operability, cybersecurity, makes us see that the elements needed for this to work must bring several sectors to participate. And the panelists today will illustrate the importance of this multi-sectoral nature, but the possibility of resolving this together. So in this timely and urgent event, what are you going to share with us? Three things first. First, we need to determine what normative measures and procedural measures are needed for digital transformation. International, are they part of the legal sector and public investment? What are these normative and procedural measures? That's the first one. Secondly, are we going to talk about how, through technology, we can solve operational challenges of supervision of works, but also challenges and solutions for cybersecurity and privacy of data? So we have the normative measures and technology with the cybersecurity. And last but not least, Nestor Roa will introduce the first results of the survey of digital maturity of infrastructure agencies that we hope will help in delineating the guidelines on how we are to deal from the bank with the sector's loans and credits in our funding operations. All of this is clear. Obviously, the digital world is nothing of the future. It is an urgent need for today. And so we're ready with you to move forward and to do it already now. Thank you all for participating. I believe that you will see things in a very fruitful day of dialogue, and I give the floor to Nestor Roa, the head of division of the Transport Division. Thank you, Nestor, and please go ahead. On the contrary, Ana Maria, thank you very much for this very important frame of reference, and thank you all for being with us in this regional dialogue, policy dialogue that deals with the digital transformation and infrastructure agencies. And the way we've begun with this talk, this is a transformation. And I would say that this is a huge transformation, similar to the one we saw with the arrival of the automobiles and the arrival of the internal combustion engine at the beginning of the century, last century. And in this transformation process, since this is the size of it, this is something that we as a bank at the IDB, we are extremely interested in dealing with this from a strategic point of view and providing support to all agencies in this work. And as Ana Maria was pointing out, the current situation has accelerated the need for moving forward with this transformation. And these transformation processes are organic and they're not linear with successes, learning messages and failures. This is what we will see. So in a joint effort amongst several areas in the bank, and you will see them represented here, during this meeting, we put together a multidisciplinary framework in order to understand the maturity of the different agencies that work with infrastructure and transport. This framework includes several important dimensions. And the first one, as we saw in the video, is the normative, regulatory, and institutional framework. It is of vital importance in order to understand what are the barriers, but also what are the facilitators for the inclusion and the use of technologies, understanding that public agencies are governed by laws and regulations that determine their operation. Then we have, as is natural, technologies available in the state and in the different governments, and those technologies, and I'm talking about those technologies that might be used by these infrastructure agencies. And besides technologies, we have the administrative management of these agencies. So we're not just starting from scratch with these agencies, that they have been operating for a long time with very well-established cultures. And this includes all processes, administrative as well as other systems that are used in public administration, including the essential issue of biosecurity. Then, in this frame of reference, we could arrive at two types of what we could call platforms. And there are a lot of terms that are used in digital transformation here. I'd like to define them, but it is important to understand that this goes beyond these terms. One is the platform for communication and transport, thinking already that what's coming with the digital transformation is a change in the ways we communicate them. Increasingly more, we communicate via digital means, quickly, transparent, and effective communication, not only between people, but all the information that moves around the value chain of infrastructure agencies. And last but not least, we have another platform or software in order to have digital management of the projects of the agency. And here we're talking about those tools or intrinsic processes to the work of agencies that are part of how they manage their projects. Throughout this dialogue, we will deal with these issues in both blocks. First, and we will move directly into that, this will be moderated by Edgardo Mosqueira, who will be sitting and concentrated on public management issues and digital government. And so I give the floor to Edgardo. Thank you, Edgardo. Thank you for being with us. Thank you very much, Nestor. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. In fact, as has been previously pointed out, this is a very important issue, not only as Ana Maria was describing, in order to face the economic consequences that COVID will bring with it, but also in order to be able to expand the provision of services where we still have a long way to go in Latin America. And during this segment of the dialogue, what we will try to do is deal with some of the preconditions that are required precisely so that the development of a digital government can take place. We are lucky enough to have with us two well-known guests, Esteban Daluz, who's Undersecretary for Mobility Management in the government of the city of Buenos Aires. And we also have with us Jose Manuel Saez Serrano, who is the trade delegate for South America of the General Department of International Business, INECO, from Spain. This is a public enterprise, and it is a tool of the Ministry for Promotion of Activities that deals with infrastructure projects. The idea of this first session is to talk about the concepts on how digital technology can truly contribute to an increase in productivity of public management. This is not only digital technology that can bring with it the transformation of the government in order to fill gaps in coverage and quality of public services, to contribute to reduce inequality and access to services, for example, improve the quality of the same, but it can also have an impact, and this is the other positive impact within public management, and how improving not only processes and procedures and eliminating paper, but how to bring in, how to attract new human talent that can deal with everything that is represented by this transformation. I would like to kick this off by addressing a question to our panelists about how they believe that this digital transformation contributes to productivity in public activity in infrastructure projects. I'd like to begin by asking Jose Manuel Saez, at INECO, how do you see the development in Spain, how this digital transformation has taken place in Spain, taking into account how it calls for a transformation in the public sector, and how do you see from Spain the development that is taking place in Latin America? Good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much to the IDB for the possibility of participating in these dialogues. And regarding your question, in Spain, there was a change. And I would draw a distinction between digitalization and digital transformation. Digital transformation as a result of the crisis, 2008, then 2012, and in order to raise productivity. And in a country such as Spain, where we have a mature infrastructure and having to face internationalization, everything took place through this digital transformation, using some initial tools that start off with research and development. But then we've seen that these are tools that can be applied for the entire life cycle of a project, because there has always been a gap between what was designed, what was built, and what materialized, having a line that did not allow us to have that total digitalization. This is what we had in a country such as Spain, where we have a mature structure, and most of the engineering and most of the constructing agencies and public enterprises, as others have said, came out to the international market, obviously finding support in this digitalization. Thank you very much. And before I give the floor to Esteban and proposing a question, we have another video. And this shows an example of how agencies at a subnational level are implementing digital solutions. I believe that this could be interesting as an introduction, as a presentation, prior to the question that we will address to Esteban.
Uno de nuestros ejes de gestión ha sido la modernización y tiene que ver esto con modernizar el Estado municipal. Cada vecino que viene tiene que presentar papeles, llenar planillas, pasan de oficinas a oficinas, son trámites burocráticos, es algo lento. Y en esa lentitud del Estado hay un vecino, hay una persona atrás de un expediente, hay una familia que está esperando una respuesta y a veces la respuesta no llega. Entonces tiene que ver con ir dando pasos día a día para poder modernizar el Estado. Y el resultado final tiene que ser, por supuesto, tener una mejor atención al vecino. Tiene que ver con un proceso que hemos avanzado primero desde lo básico, de comprar computadoras que no había, de poder dotarlas a las computadoras de sistemas y software que permitan también tener una mejor agilidad y dar un mejor servicio, dotarlo de servidores, dotar de infraestructura necesaria para que haya una buena conexión en lo que tiene que ver con redes.
Adelante, Edgardo.
Gracias. Esteban, volviendo al tema de cómo la transformación digital requiere de
Going back to how this digital transformation calls for transformation in public activity, I wanted to ask you, what is your experience in the city of Buenos Aires? The city of Buenos Aires has made significant progress in including digital technology, not only to provide services, but also to include citizen participation in taking a look at services and watching how the progress in public works is taking place. So we'd like to hear from you about the experiences that you have developed in connection with this issue. I believe that your microphone is mute. Yes. So thank you. Thank you to the IDB for inviting Buenos Aires and yours truly to participate in this wonderful dialogue. Regarding your question, Edgardo, one of the things that we have discovered and we've been working on for 10 years is a lot of investment in transfer infrastructure in PRTs, the metro, the underground, to have high-speed ways. But one of the things that we've detected in infrastructure works is the work that has to be done later on after the work and the data that have to be obtained. As you were saying at the beginning, everything that is projected in that work and the service that it will provide it, then it materializes and then the concrete results. So we've adapted everything to the system of buses, everything by computer, but that not only gives us a position, we also had to standardize that data formats and to launder and clear a base, a zero base, to have all the grounds, 137 lines, 10,000 units that roam around Buenos Aires, so that later on we could understand whether the times are being complied with, whether they're complying with the arrival and departure, whether the stops are being met with the buses and the subway. Then we have to understand that this RT, for which we paid a lot of money, whether they're sticking to the times and whether the same concept is being applied to other areas. In those, we have this system where we've imposed a system that was not working, and now we have all the information regarding stations and where the buses are headed, and we have the same system for taxis. Obviously, we've also done this for the train, for the underground, the metro, and then this is to make sure that the operation parameters that we promised during the design state will be kept and maintained. And what is even more interesting is that the more data we draw in our infrastructure regarding how it's working and what is the level of service that is being provided in each transportation medium. And this is shared with society in an open way, in real time. And we allow many apps to use the information on bus routes in order to provide different services to the user. Service as to what is the best stop, combinations, prices, etc. There are different apps and each one focuses on different things. Each one has its own commercial strategy. And so the system becomes much more flexible, versatile, in order to understand better its options. One of the things that we had to deal with in Buenos Aires, for example, is that we had very little transfer and people had to go a long way in a bus when maybe they could just use a transfer to a subway station and be able to arrive at the same port of destination and doing quicker. But they didn't do it because they didn't have the information. They didn't know whether the subway was working, whether it is arriving on time, whether it is full. So they continued on a bus. So I believe that this is a side result of the data and the technology that we can contribute to this infrastructure. We make it more intelligent, it works better, and we provide better transport service.
Edgardo, estás en mute.
Edgardo, your microphone is mute. Thank you very much. And before I go on to the next question, I'd like to share with you some thoughts about these issues that you've mentioned. I believe that it is quite important to take into account that you're saying that in order to set this operation in motion, all digital technology has been important, and it's been necessary to change processes, to change regulations, procedures, etc. And essentially, they establish new administrative routines that make it easier to have interoperability and the possibility that all agencies could use the data. But another issue that I wish to highlight is what you were saying at the end about the versatility of the service, how all these data allow us to have information made available to citizens so that the citizens, in a way, will have the possibility of deciding how to use a service, having options. This is a crucial element because in the past we had a public administration that designed processes and procedures in order to produce services that were standard, the same for all. Nowadays, the technology is allowing these services to be customized, to be adapted to the needs and the usefulness that the citizen can get out of this. I believe that this is another one of the elements of a radical change on how the public administration is working. From a public administration that was standard with a standard product for all citizens, now we have the possibility of a public administration that allows citizens to have options regarding the service and for the service to ultimately be designed in keeping with the needs of the citizen. But all of this change, normative change, procedural change in the processes, this accumulation of data, the use and the availability of data, comes hand in hand with the need of a whole set of reforms, quite significant reforms. And for these reforms to take place, we need triggers, formal triggers. As was well mentioned by Ana Maria at the beginning, we believe that the COVID is a great trigger because it makes us see in a radical way the need for having technology. And I believe that this also gives governments the possibility of moving forward in this transformation. And with this, I would like to ask Jose Manuel. And my question is essentially the following. Which one do you believe is the factor that triggered everything in Spain? What were the elements that pushed and that led this transformation to the success that we see in Spain, that Spain has undertaken in the last few years?
On one side, and I said this already, it's an economic situation, but also the fact that Spain is part of the European Union and that a lot of the regulations are supranational. In other words, everybody plays by the same rules in each country. That has boosted development. And that is the major challenge because things like the VIM that has been implemented, it's called the VIM tax, and they're all European countries define, they set the rule, and I can go to any European country and I find the same rule. It's applied by all states, and that is very helpful. Because of that, we have a single datum that is dealt with, and also today's technology allows us to work with open source technology, and that lowers the cost of the technology. So that is the major leap forward. And because of that, we have become an international benchmark in transportation infrastructure. Thank you. I'm going back to our colleague Esteban, and I wanted to ask him if you had to make a recommendation to the governments of Latin America regarding the first steps to take in order to begin the digital transformation, what tools do you think need to be built first? What would your recommendation be? What would be the logical first steps to be taken so as to move quickly? We have to realize that the city of Buenos Aires already has a track record. It's already covered a lot of ground and has learned a lot of lessons. So I think it would be very interesting for us to know exactly what lessons you could share with us. Yes, definitely. And I would divide my remarks in two. First of all, the low-hanging fruit. I began to work for Buenos Aires 3.5 years ago. I wasn't coming from transport, and I realized that there was a lack of data available, and I began to interconnect all the data I could find without worrying about where it was coming from. Just to give you an idea, I tried to connect all the stoplights to a central system. I looked at the cameras on the trains, on the metros, on the highways, then the vehicle counters, all of the ticket issuances, the reports of incidents. First of all, we began to use Waze for that. Then we used our own information and uploaded it. But I said, okay, first I have to find some data. So it's a matter of doing the plumbing. And that's necessary so that later on you can begin to manage, plan, and supervise. Now, second, there's a lot of data that isn't there, and you have to generate the infrastructure. So I told you what was there. Now, in Buenos Aires, this is a project we haven't been able to implement, but taxis, we have very little information. All we know is how many licenses have been granted. We don't know how many taxis are on the road, how many trips they've taken, nothing. So there's a project which is to put taxis online so we can figure out where the taxis are. Are they empty? Do they have a passenger? Are they at home? So have some interaction. And with that, also, we have an online bicycle system, a connectivity system online. So there are different projects. So first I'm generating data. Later on, I'll get to managing them. So we're putting these things online. Something else that I would recommend, something that we have in the planning stage, is a law on transportation. And this is very important because the data that provide to the state a description of transportation services, and here I'm talking about both public and private transportation, that information is of public interest and it's tremendously valuable. It can be used by transport operators. So I'm talking not only about public transportation, taxis, also carpooling, the scooters, bicycle systems, all of the systems you can think of that are shared use, either in space or in time. All of those together are the different transport options that citizens have. So they should all be sharing information on the status of the service. In other words, this is the bus. It will be at the bus stop at such and such a time. This is the number of scooters that are near where you are. So all of that information, it's available. If it's posted, as I said before, allows the citizen to have many more options in terms of how to travel. Now, the worst option is a private car. But of course, that has to be a valid alternative. So I think that that information on transportation is an essential step. It is basically the groundwork we need. And then lastly, someone was talking about human resources a while ago. It's essential that our human resources understand how to work with data. In Buenos Aires, when I joined, there was a big team, very successful with a lot of projects, but they were all architects. Now, I highly respect architects. I even have a brother who's an architect. But those people have to work with people that know how to get data, how to process them, and then give that information to the transport planners. So they have information to decide for better projects and better information. I heard some noise. I think I went over my time. Edgardo, you're muted. That was wonderful. And you brought up something very important. Now we can look at some of the questions we got from the participants, and there's some very interesting ones. Here's one that I wanted to share with you. One of the issues that we have been analyzing in the bank is how can we respond to the digital transformation in terms of one of the most important inputs, i.e. human resources. A digital transformation requires a whole set of skills that aren't necessarily present in today's public sector. And sometimes they are a barrier and they stand in the way of accelerating the digital transformation. So the question that we're getting asked by the audience is, how are these new human resources arrangements reflected in the infrastructure agencies? How has this transformation been done? Have you hired new people with digital skills, or have you created external partnerships? Have you defined the actions needed for the transformation? In other words, how have you managed human resources so as to attract the necessary talent required for the transformation? Jose Manuel, why don't you begin by telling us what the experience has been like in Spain? Well, in our case, and here I'm adding to what Esteban was saying, we found a lot of engineering. We have civil engineers, aeronautical engineers, but 7 years ago, a very good decision was made, and that was an IT department was established. It has 400 people, mathematicians, IT experts, and in-house, they have allowed us to support public enterprises and the government to develop applications, and those applications have been exported and they're even used internationally. For example, at the IDB, they're using a program that was developed in-house. It's called CIOS. It's an information system to monitor works, and it was created because of the needs of a shareholder, and this produced a product that wound up being a consulting service. So it's a matter of adapting and finding people that understand, that develop, and that are highly productive in terms of creating this type of tool. In this case, it's an information technology tool. Now, the idea is that it be in-house. Why? Because that gives you value added, it helps your positioning, and this was a very good decision that was made 7 years ago. Edgardo, you're muted. Thank you. Now, let's continue by asking the same question. Esteban, I would ask you, what did you do? Did you hire new people? Did you follow Spain's model? Did you set up a unit in charge of producing all of the software, all of the plans, etc., for that digital transformation, or did you use some other mechanism? What we did, and this is a matter of policy, tried to focus on setting good rules of the game that make it possible that services, everything having to do with transportation, follow the same rules. Now, what we've done with my team is focus on getting people that understood what technology made possible. And we designed the architecture of the solution we were after. We figured out what we needed to buy, how we had to establish the rules of the game. For me, that is the most important thing. I don't think that the state needs to hire programmers or people from different backgrounds, people specialized in infrastructure. That's something the private sector knows how to do and do well. The most important thing is, especially regarding digital transformation, that occurs very quickly. A lot of the innovation comes from the outside. So to a certain extent, we're attacked, quote, quote, but in a positive way. So we need people that understand what technology enables us to do. And then we have to look at regulation, making sure that regulation promotes innovation. And then we have to try to leave the old behind. It usually doesn't interact new with the new. So we have to understand what is possible. We have to look at the business model. In our case, it's the transportation business model. Thank you. And then one final quick question to both of you, because we are getting short on time. But this has to do with an important thing, and that is interinstitutional coordination, interoperability of systems. That presupposes routines, clear rules for coordination, so that, as one of the participants said, we don't want the agencies to be jealous and try to protect their own data. So how do you facilitate coordination amongst agencies so that they are willing to share data efficiently? Jose Manuel, would you like to start? Sure. It's very necessary. At the speed with which the world is evolving, it makes no sense to try to show your own internal capacity working by yourself. You need the support of others, especially because today we have an advantage, and that is a lot of the programs that you're using are public use. They are free, and that information, the more you share it, the more you test it, the more effective it is. That is what we have been able to prove. The idea of obscurantism takes you nowhere. And those of us who work with different transportation modes, and we work, for example, of intermodality, connecting airports to rail systems, all of that information has to be shared with the operator, with the telephone company, whoever can facilitate the provision of that information. So we need to come up with a single datum. And I could add to what was just said, Edgardo. Once again, Edgardo, you're muted. First, we have to begin by saying that whatever you have has to be made available. You have to show you're not afraid of other people using your data. For example, something that happened today, a company that we published with published a news article saying where there were some bus stops that were unsafe. But that's a good thing. So you have to set your fears aside. Now, if they don't share their data, if they want to be left out, let me see if I can come up with examples. Say trains don't want to share their data. So people say, okay, well, I don't know if I should take the train. Maybe we won't take the train. So the best thing that you can do to overcome turf wars, these fears, is to open up and open up. Show what you have, and that will attract sharing on the part of others. Thank you. And before we conclude, I wanted to thank Jose Manuel Saez and Esteban Galusi You have highlighted some very important elements in the experience of both Spain and Argentina. And these are things that go beyond shared data, process integration, this whole idea of obscurantism, of hiding your data, not wanting to share. That makes no sense because right now, the best way to provide a service is by cooperating amongst agencies and by sharing information and data. I think there's another very important issue that you have brought up having to do with the need to place data at the disposal of people. Not only are the data for the public service for the government. The idea is to make the data available to the population so they can see how to best use public services. And another important thought had to do with the different possibilities, the different potential arrangements to attract human talent that is required for digital transformation. We have the possibility of establishing units in-house, hiring or creating teams of people that work on digital transformation, or another possibility is using outsourcing and attracting knowledge and know-how from the private sector. So I wanted to thank you very, very much for your thoughts, for your opinions. This really is helpful in understanding how digital transformation is a challenge we face and a challenge that we have to address soon. So now I call on Nestor Roa. Thank you very much, Edgardo. Thank you, Esteban. Thank you, Jose Manuel. We see that there are three major issues here that are important for the infrastructure and the transportation industries. First of all, we have the matter of processes. Now, there's a natural tendency, something almost intuitive on the part of engineers, and I'm an engineer, so I can see myself here. Our initial reaction is go out and buy the software, go buy the software, the hardware, but what we have to do is review our processes, the processes that in an organization generate the value that citizens are calling for. In this case, for our transport services that are citizen targeted. So we look at processes. We may have to change that process, get rid of it, or create a new one. And then we can get to digital transformation. And then the next issue that was raised has to do with data. And that's a new subject for the infrastructure industry, and it is broad. We heard about the piping, the interconnection. We have to figure out how we can standardize our data. First of all, gather it, then put it at the service of government. So there has to be expertise in this regard to understand what is being done. And then also that dovetails with the matter of human resources. There, I have to decide what I can do in-house and what I should subcontract. So we need to be able to translate the data, the information world, all these algorithms, all these technological things, and we have to work with architects, the professionals that are trying to solve the problems of infrastructure. And so there, it's a matter of human resources. So there are many different alternatives. I don't have to have all of those people on staff. And a lot depends on where I am. If I'm in Spain, if I'm in Argentina or Honduras, I may find a different solution. So it's a very complex issue, and I would say the idea is to be more multidisciplinary in the sector, to be open to other visions, and other disciplines. But there is something that is relatively new to all of us, and that is something that is seen in military and civil life, also in espionage, the protection of information. Used to, that wasn't all that important for our industry, but it is today. And this is very important. I'm referring to cybersecurity. We hear more and more about hacker attacks, servers that have been hijacked, accounts that cannot be accessed. So we have to see how we can protect information. It may be a public service, but I have to know how to protect that information, how to do that with servers in the cloud, and also how we can work remotely. And information services have migrated to the cloud, making cybersecurity more and more a challenge. Now, in the next block of our program, that is exactly the topic we wanted to look at. We're going to hear from Gonzalo Rivas, who is going to talk about the relationship between public servers and technology providers and cybersecurity. So, Gonzalo, please go ahead. Thank you very much, Nestor. It's a true pleasure to be here with you in this important seminar. Just as you said, and just as Ana Maria commented, the truth is this pandemic has accelerated our trend towards digitalization, our digital transformation, but it's something that was already underway, something that was unavoidable, especially now with the Internet of Things and 5G. Now, in contrast to many previous developments in this area, through 5G, there are many real sectors that are going to be affected, that are being affected. And that opens up this whole challenge about how transportation operators in the region, how all of the infrastructure gets into digitalization. And as you were saying, this is a major challenge. There is a specific challenge, which is transforming or reforming our human resources, but then there are things that we have heard raised several times by the former president of Estonia. He had a dialogue with President Moreno just a few days ago. So cybersecurity, as they were pointing out, is essential because in that way, corporations, individuals can trust the data available. And that has to do with data privacy, how much data should I release and share, but it also has to do with data integrity to make sure that the data is not tampered with. I think there's a video that we can show now. I don't know if I should show the video or if you would prefer that we look at the interview. Let's look at the video. It's a targeted attack, and it has hijacked several devices, including a server. So the server has been hijacked by hackers. That's like when you kidnap someone, they call and say, we want so much money to release your invoicing system. Right, they are asking for cryptocurrency as ransom. A lot of hacking attacks have been carried out, and this makes everyone feel like going back to using pencil and paper. Okay. That was quite telling, right? That's the type of risk that we run. So since these are challenges we face in the region, I think that having the possibility of talking about or with Francisco Lázaro, he works for Renfo, and he is also an academician. He works in this area in Spain, and so it's a true privilege to have Francisco with us. Francisco, it's a pleasure to have you. And I begin with a very basic question. I think it's important for the whole audience. Could you tell us a bit about the essential elements in the digital transformation of Renfe and why cybersecurity has been such a high priority for you. Well, thank you. First of all, I wanted to thank the IDB for its kind invitation. I thank you, Gonzalo, and the other organizers of the webinar, and I thank the webinar audience for their time. Renfe is the main operator of Spanish railways. We have 1,600 kilometers of high velocity tracks. We transport passengers, and also last year we had $4 billion in revenue. That is just to give you an idea of the size of this company, and it is my honor to be the manager of cybersecurity and privacy. Now, you were talking about the central function of cybersecurity. Perhaps what we should say is that we facilitate maintenance of opportunities and operations. Now, we would love it if we were a central element, but we are fortunate because we do engage very actively. That role has been conquered by incorporating our concerns in any service or any product right from the early stages. What would have been ideal is if this would have been behind the original design of a product or service, but basically we are in the part where the technical verifications come in. We understand the project, we look at the threats, we understand the operability, the importance of data and information, and then after that, we can do a risk analysis. This closeness to projects, we may not be there from the first hours, but we do get incorporated quickly. Now, how did this get started? Let me tell you a bit about our history. We were created 61 years ago. We bought the first computer. The IT unit had staff having to do with security of the railway. But 8 years ago, we decided to give information security to two areas. One having to do with risk management policy, in other words, how things should be done. And in that same area that I head, we are in charge of audit. We do oversight. We supervise activities. We investigate incidents. And all of those activities give us an idea of how things are being done. On one hand, how things should be done and how they're actually being done. And then another area is the operation of the railways. In other words, those that are maintaining the IPSs, the trains, etc. So that segregation of functions is important, and it is a good organizational principle to have segregation because we do things day by day, but someone has a strategic overview of how things should be done. And especially someone is making sure that things are being done in a way that complies with the strategy and that weaknesses don't get created that can be used by others.
Thank you very much, Francisco. Highly illustrative. An element that came up in the conversation previously, and that for us at the bank, we attach a central role, is the issue of talent and the issue of the training of human resources. We are convinced, as was mentioned by Nestor, overcoming it's a bias that at the end of the day, this issue more than technology and change in processes is a change of culture, change of approach, etc. So in a company that has turned around in a very successful way, but that deals with this issue of cybersecurity because it becomes an essential element. How did you deal with the training of the staff, the personnel, in areas, for example, that are truly very remote? And I'm thinking of the operation of railways, for example, the legal department, the files, those are departments that are somewhere else. So there's a whole set of areas that ultimately would seem not to be touched, but that need to be touched because otherwise the machines get stuck. work. So what have you done so that the whole set of the organization will become digital, the entire organization, and not only to have certain segments of the digital operation? Well, when we talk about the implementation processes of digital transformations, what aspects are being dealt with, well, Nestor referred to this, and we spoke of three elements. We have the processes on the one hand, on the other one, we have the organization, then we have the technical tools, and we have the people, which is what you were asking. And so all of that is a whole set, not isolated pieces. And what you're asking now, and what Gonzalo was asking about the personnel, what we've done is the following. On internet and intranet in the company, we publish brief boxes of information. We provide the information, and then we have campaigns controlled by us, simply to make sure that the people, that our workers have read and understood what we're telling them. Hand in hand with this, we have specific training courses on cybersecurity, but there are also some basic units that are provided to the entire staff in the company. The welcome, where we explain the different organizational units and the functions, etc. And before they go to the new organizational units, there's a specific talk on privacy and cybersecurity. And therein, we try to get to them in a very personal way, not so much in a professional way, but in a personal way, telling them about the risks of daily cybersecurity threats that we face, which is a trap, because what we have in our daily life is something that we face in our professional life. And what we face in our professional life is what we face in our personal life. So we give that training to the people coming into the company. We also organize laboratories where we hire hackers that have a significant communication capacity so that they can give us exhibitions on how they've been threatened in their personal life in order to raise awareness, because ultimately, at the end, you become aware of what you understand, and that you understand that it can affect you. So that is what is done in that field, but many other things are done. For example, the security committee deals with communication, and the support committee for the provision of data are present, human resources, legal department, etc. In these areas, to these spokesperson, they're given information so that they can exercise their activity as a spokesperson in this field, but also with the responsibility of looking after the cybersecurity. And we want to involve them in the transmission channel of that knowledge, particularly when they attempt to let the people know that are with them in these areas, that they have to go to the training courses that we provide, to the laboratories, that they have to read these notes or these little bullets that we create, and look at all the information that we attempt to give them in order to change not only their training, but also the education courses. We organize cyber exercises where we involve all these areas, legal, human resources, at the physical department, and this is work that we do in that field. Thank you, Francisco. I love the idea of counterattacking hackers. Yeah, that's telework. That's telework that we do. Listen, a company does not act on its own. It is not in a vacuum. And particularly a company such as Renfe, you must have a lot of suppliers. And obviously, when you adopt transformations that are so innovative, and you establish your very high cybersecurity standards, what do you do in order to begin relating with the suppliers, with the vendors in this sense? How are you able to help so that those suppliers that acquire these standards, who establishes these standards? Because many times we don't even have a universal standard, because we're innovating day by day. And I know that you have an experience, and maybe it would be interesting for you to tell us in this context, this environment that you've created, which is called Train Lab, which I believe is something quite original and interesting. Could you tell us about this? Well, Gonzalo, I was simply stressing the issue of processes, and just like other colleagues have done this in the past. We have changed the security process. It's been formalized, and it is now part of the general process. And within that process, what we've done is to compel, because it is a requirement, so that any product or service will have assistance. And this means that we participate in these initial phases. And in keeping with what you're asking concretely, what we've done is that this is an accelerator of startups that sponsors us. And what we've done there is to help them when they give us ideas, when they come up with ideas, and when the tests are to be performed in order to have that accelerator materialize. What we do is bring in their privacy department. We provide advice, requirements that we can provide, and in that case, we consider them as something of our own, and therefore we provide advice so that these pilot tests, even though they're pilot tests, they're operational, and therefore they must have a principle of cybersecurity available. And they must also create the cybersecurity culture. Many times this is not taking place, not even in university. If we take a university in telecommunications, which allegedly are very much geared to the issue of cybersecurity, with 170 postgraduate students, you have 15 or 20 that devote their future to cybersecurity. And if you ask how many of us in the cybersecurity classes know what a firewall is, they will raise your hand. All that I'm saying is real. And so we must attempt to help them understand about that need for their products, and that later on they will give it through their entrepreneurial life. What else do we do in paying attention to our suppliers, our vendors, and how to guide them? Well, in our technical test, amongst the requirements that we establish so that specifically we can work on that product or service, we analyze, we ask them that they have, for example, someone responsible for the product or the service. The product or service that will be sold must have someone behind the project, the design and the organization. And on top of that, they must have someone responsible for cybersecurity for that product or service. Because if not, what we have on paper and later on what is going to take place, there's a very important gap between one and the other one. And who must worry about this in the supplier company? And with that, we try to at least follow basic principles and implement these from the very beginning, because if not, it is like having a car. And when the car is delivered, you ask about what the wheel is, what the brake is, and they can say, well, you didn't ask about it, so the car doesn't have it. Yes, we can add it to this, so I have to take it back to the factory, and you have to pay 3 times more. That's a reality. Either you stipulate the requirements before the tender, before the bid, and if it is a part of the value of the data, if you've identified someone internally responsible for the information that will be responsible for that risk management that they must perform, and on the other hand, you identify that the supplier must have someone responsible for cybersecurity. They must analyze the risk because their offer must have cybersecurity. Then little by little, we start weaving a good fabric of protection. And we're still far from it because, as we were saying in one of our previous conversations, the responsible for cybersecurity is somewhat like the striker, the forward, the player in soccer. If they fail, if they cannot score a goal, it comes out in the headlines. We see that they failed, but then the whole team is guilty. But the strikers, the forwards, if they miss once or if they score, then they've done it. It is much more difficult to defend this than attacking. And therefore, we must formalize the processes so that in a methodical way, we could even be capable of following this philosophy. Thank you. I played as a goalkeeper, and it's a very, very difficult position. Besides, it brings an added suffering to that. Yes, it is very difficult, and you suffer a lot, and you don't end up being a hero. Now we're going to some questions that are asked by the public, the suppliers, the vendors, something that you were saying. But there's another question here, and it is, how do you see the use, the risk, the possible benefits of blockchain technologies in the public sector, and in particular, in dealing with the issues that you're covering? Well, if all these innovation issues, you must clearly understand why you want that technology. What for? Innovation, how to innovate the process, how to innovate the forms of things. And we think a lot about the technology. In the case of blockchain, I cannot give you major approaches because for us, blockchain, so far, I'm not saying about tomorrow, but so far, we have not made any inroads into that field. Maybe we've tried other innovative fields, but not blockchain. Why? Because for starters, blockchain is a decentralized mechanism of location of information. So when the information is not decentralized, it is part in our system. If you go towards collaborative mechanisms where you not only cooperate parts in one service, but all the parts have a value and they're equal, then it would make sense. For example, Renfe has came up with a concept that it will empower, which is the RAS, which is the access service, which is endowing us or providing a service first and last mile together with transportation by railway so that you can go from home to a station, you can take a taxi, you can take a bus, you can take a scooter, you select your medium, and then you take the railway, you go to the city, and there in turn you use other means of transportation. But that's quite innovative, and it's quite collaborative. But being collaborative, not all parts have the same weight in the organization and the provision of services. If that were the case, then perhaps a blockchain would make sense. And there's no technology that in itself is safe or unsafe. Safe or unsafe is defined by the four elements: the organization, the processes, the technologies, and people. This is what makes something safe or unsafe, and that's why we have risk analysis. I know that is why we have this on paper and pencil and very obsolete, but it is essential to have this and to act on the basis of risk. And for this to be done on the basis of risk, the development of information and the risk that we have because of its exploitation or because of the use and tenure of technology. Thank you, very clear. And one last question that I don't want to overlook, and in fact, these are two questions in one. The first one has to do with this issue of the standard of cybersecurity that Renfe has, and this issue of cooperating with other public agencies. If you have a very high standard, and there are other businesses that don't have such a high level in the transportation system or in the public system, this will give rise to problems. Then how do we establish that minimum standard? Is it established by the public authority or the companies that come to an agreement? And the second question, very briefly, because of the late hour. In this seminar, there's a lot of representations of transport that are moving forward in Latin America. What is your main recommendation for them in this sphere? How should they deal with this if they're not dealing with this? Or how should they reinforce this? Well, if you agree, since we don't have a lot of time, let us begin with the last one, and then we can go back to the first part of the question. The way I believe that we should build a correct approach in cybersecurity, well, the first thing you have to do is to have an effective organization structure. Companies have to think about how their organization will take place. If you have someone responsible, whether it is going to operate or not, well, first of all, whether they have or not resources in order to operate the security. There are a lot of companies, even one that is important, that does not have cybersecurity separate from systems. I believe that they need it because you need experts and professionals in that field. Secondly, how is your organization going to take place? If this is a critical infrastructure, in Spain we have critical infrastructures. If the OT part will be connected to IT, if security will be together or not, operations with IT. If you establish governance and that entails risks, this means that the cybersecurity strategy must be based on risk analysis, and they all need it to train, develop, and educate our staff. That is essential, and not to get discouraged. That is also very important, particularly for our colleagues that know more about cybersecurity, because whoever you ask, cybersecurity is very important. They understand it. It goes deep to their heart. But in many cases later on, cybersecurity is still seen as a stopper of the function and the advances in technology and the operation. And it is not that. What we want to do about innovation or functionality must be done, but it must be done in a safe way. And maybe it is not the way it has been designed or considered by the person responsible that wanted to work on that function, and they have to modify something for it to be safe and secure. But I think it's essential. And to establish a capacity to respond that could be external or their own, but you must understand that we will all have a serious accident. But the fact is that companies that are mature, that devote resources, that have an organization, that have technologies, processes, etc., let's say that we have a daily attacks. We record more than 1 billion events a day. And I repeat, 1 billion events, cybersecurity events every day in our systems. We are constantly being attacked. So in that constantly being attacked, it might happen that they will be able to penetrate our systems. So you become famous, and it seems that you've done absolutely nothing. It is not that the organization is important. It does important things for society, and therefore it is much more attractive for the bad guys. There are a lot of bad guys, and they know more, and they are much more people. So these would be the advice that I could give, if we could give any advice. Thank you very much, Francisco. Very useful. And we are coming to the closing time. I'd like to thank you on behalf of the bank, the Infrastructure and Transport Division, and it is not up to me to go on to something else, but it seems to me that a key aspect is what you mentioned, which is try to include from the very beginning cybersecurity in all these processes, and even in the relation with innovations that are being generated. So Francisco, thank you very much once again. And we give the floor back to Nestor.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo. Thank you, Francisco. That was very interesting. We talk about many different processes, many different players, and cybersecurity and its importance as we move ahead in these sectors. Something so simple as a road, where we're trying to integrate all of the information on design from the time it's in the hands of the designers. Here we're thinking about hydrology, engineering, and then a designer defines the specifications. So the ideal thing would be for the process leading up to the bidding to occur with no interruption. But right now, the process is interrupted. The information gets packaged as every bidder looks at that information. So just imagine the security challenges we have for information that is important not only for cost, but also in terms of the work itself or the operation of the services provided by those works once they are up and operating. Now, in talking about data, and here we're getting close to the end of our event, I did want to share with you some information results that we obtained in recent weeks. We've worked with 15 different infrastructure agencies in the region, and we began to get a clear idea of where we stand. Now, we're going to show a presentation to you that summarizes the results of our survey. First of all, let's talk about systematizing areas in agencies. We would like for agencies to continue to incorporate technology so as to expedite management and provide better citizen services. However, in terms of the communication processes that are so important in the current situation, 64% of the agencies reported that their communication was digital, but not necessarily was that the communications related to the management or execution of projects, where paper is still prevalent. So not only paper, bond paper, and communications require the use of email or WhatsApp or voice messaging. And as you know, they are tools not designed for that purpose. So digitalization should encompass the entire agency. Every part needs to include technology. We analyze the different areas. where agencies already have digitized systems where they operate and where they do not. We see that payments and accounting are digitalized in most agencies, and here is where most of the hacking has occurred, actually. So that requires the attention of cybersecurity areas, but things like project management, procurement has less digitization. Now, regarding the agencies where we carried out the survey, we also did in-depth interviews, and 57% of procurement doesn't reflect all of the processes being carried out on paper, and 71% for project management. But there can be management software, but if so, that the software does not communicate with other systems. So here we get into data and its integration, as well as the data integrity. Now, let's look at digital management within the agency. The implementation of technology can allow hiring technological services to occur in a more efficient way. What we see is that in most cases, it takes at least 3 months, and we think that that could probably be shortened to 1 month. Look at the time on average that it takes an agency to hire a technology service. It takes more than a year in 36% of the cases, and between 3 and 6 months, we find 43%. Several areas work as silos, or they have information on paper, making it very difficult to share that information with other areas or units. Now, this is within the same agency. It's not a matter of working across agencies. So information should be connected amongst all of these different offices so as to be able to access that information when needed. Here on this slide, we're showing the limitation of current software use for projects, and it shows that there is only 21% of approvals of benchmarks and project approval are done online, and only 15% have project indicators that are automatic. That means that the probability of error in interpreting or capturing the data can create additional errors, and then they can get multiplied when this data is interpreted later on. Now, on the next slide, we can see how the current and future situation, the fiscal situation, efficiency gains because of digitization will be important. So digital modernization will help improve the value of what we offer as citizen services, and we've been talking about that, because we make public resources more available. And that is why we would like to be able to announce an agenda of digital transformation focusing on transportation infrastructure. We will continue to work with the rest of the bank. We will work and deepen the diagnosis and look at technological maturity, and we will see what agencies are better off, are most advanced in certain aspects, and how we can share that with other countries that are members of the bank. Also, we would like to look at bank projects and ways to implement projects more efficiently. Then another thing will be organic implementation, taking into a case the design elements, the priorities of each country. Fourth, another thing that is required, and we will support that, we have to deepen the understanding and training about cybersecurity, design manuals for management of sensitive data. And lastly, we're going to begin with pilots where we have received requests already from countries so that we can have our technical people work with these resources. We're going to work with Brazil, with road projects in some states, and in that way we can move ahead looking at the appropriate tools and measures. Now, this is basically the agenda that we're pursuing as a bank. We will keep you abreast of future steps, and We are just about out of time for our event, and there are some questions that have not been answered. We will take note. We will keep the chat so we can get back to you. But I wanted to thank the moderators and the panelists who were part of today's Regional Policy Dialogue. And I want to give the floor now to our manager of Infrastructure and Energy, Agustin Aguirre. The floor is yours. Thank you, Nestor. Can you hear me? Thank you for inviting me. I wanted to thank all of the panelists, the guests, the people from the bank, everyone who has been with us this afternoon. I will be brief because there's one thing that I've learned about connectivity is that it's easy to connect, but it's also easy to disconnect, especially if people get bored, they tend to leave. Also, I wanted to express my appreciation for this opportunity to talk about the future, the importance of technological action, digitization, and not keep talking about the impact of coronavirus because that is something that is being has become almost boring. We've heard so much. So now that we're talking about transformation of institutional processes, there is an incredible agenda of many activities that could be improved by using technological tools. We could be designing infrastructure projects, calculating units, putting together official budgets, and looking at different mapping and digital instruments for our projects, or we could reorder execution, and we could look at the physical route of projects and have traceability of changes, facilitate decision-making amongst all of the players involved in any work. We could review hotspots on transmission lines using drones or finding operational abnormalities. We could also look at our networks to take creative action for both energy and water using AI. We could operate constructed infrastructure to rationalize demand by making massive use of tools that are data-based and use AI. Also, we could collect tolls without having toll booths on our roads. We could have a dynamic structure to charge congestion fees. So if we look at the modern infrastructure that I just painted a picture of, we are going to have to rely on technology and oversight. We in the IDB want to work side by side with countries, sharing experiences and technologies with all of our members. Never have these possibilities been more technologically attainable. So I wanted to thank all of you for attending our webinar this afternoon. I hope to see you soon in another event that is part of this series that is hosted by the bank. Thank you. I thank all of you for your participation, and please do join us for future sessions of our regional policy dialogues of the Inter-American Development Bank. Thank you very much for your participation. Goodbye.